Well, good morning. This is Jonathan Albin, the Game Market Guru on Just in Time Productions series Games Mastery. And as usual, I have to shut off my little alarms here that are going off, so let me know that it's for the show, so to speak. Today we're going to be talking about the evolution of a game master. And I want to start first with that term. I've been in several conversations over the last few weeks because I am a dungeon master for Dungeons and Dragons, but I prefer the term game master, and I've had several people ask me about it. And for clarification, the term game master to me refers to being able to storytell any game system, and I do mean any, whether you're playing Carcassonne or Warhammer 40k or Dungeons and Dragons or the plethora of non-standard RPGs that are out there, things like Call of Cthulhu or whatever. When you are a storyteller in any of those categories, the term game master is more appropriate. Having said that, I want to talk this week about the course by which one evolves into being a game master. And I'll start with the beginning, when you first get a games product or introduced to you, whether it be as a player or whatever, and you get fascinated with the idea of being the storyteller, the guy behind the screen, so to speak. The very first stage is really about revelation, about learning and developing an understanding of the rules system itself. This will manifest in terms of the game by being fairly slow and clunky. Players spend a lot of time waiting for the game master to make decisions, to refer to the different charts or whatever. And over this introductory period, the game sessions are usually pretty direct, pretty simple. There's a monster, kill the monster. There's a treasure, grab the treasure, and so on. And at this initial stage, a player who's experiencing a brand new game master can become impatient fairly quickly unless they are aware of how early in the process they are, in which case they tend to be really, really patient. My experience with game mastery, in particular dealing with running a game when I was new to it, the very first few players I worked with were ultimately patient. And as time goes by and you do become more proficient with the rule system, you become kind of a know-it-all. You know exactly which chart to go to, you know which page to expertly flip to, and all of that. But in that meantime, before you get to that point, the players can take advantage. I was, in the very first few sessions that I ran when I was a youngster, way back in first edition and before the Player's Handbook was even released for Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, I was with a group of players who were older than me and more sophisticated. And although I had built a map and drawn out all these detailed situations and conditions, they basically turned and twisted the story under me, even though I was the game master, so that they literally walked through from one end to the other, just literally tearing through the walls and knocking over the doors and things like that, because I hadn't considered any of those kind of parameters, like how thick a door is or how long it takes to chop through a wall and what kind of noise that will create, and all the other parameters and variables. So I would caution you as a brand new game master to not become too discouraged when players see through your veneer or see past what you intend as a story, because this is just the first stage of your learning. Now, once you have a fairly decent handle on the game, then it becomes a matter of you become rather investigative, and you might even be a little emulative. And what I mean by that is you'll read a book and want to do what you read in a book, or you'll see a movie and want the action in the movie to be replicated. And the players, if they're willing, will certainly play along with this and enjoy it. In other cases, they can be, eye-rolling and frustrated with you as a game master because your ability to disguise your sources hasn't developed yet. So I wouldn't consider this to be a dangerous situation for a new game master, but it is one where you can fall easily into a trap where you only run pre-produced modules and storyline bits that already exist from other people's stories because it's safe. You know the rules, you know the mechanisms, you know what needs to happen when, but you don't have to do the creative side. You're not actually building the story for yourself. So it's important as a game master to realize that this too is just a step. And once you've been working with the product long enough and the different modules to know the storyline behind it, and particularly when you get to know it to the point where it's known backwards and forwards and you have a real feel for what might happen, then you start to be investigative. And this, I think, in some ways is the most fun portion of being a game master. And this is where you are experimenting with the monsters, finding out what they're capable of, looking through. I switched subjects a minute. I remember that in this phase, one of the things that I wanted to do was have my players meet every monster in the monster manual, to fight every creature I could possibly come up with, so I could see how they would react to it and interact with it. In this stage, what develops, though, is a kind of a disdain for the individual player, because you start to see the group as your enemy, and you build the story, and the monsters have to become progressively more difficult to overcome. And there is again a critical point in this stage of development, as you are proficient with the rules and you're working with the various monster types and learning all the possibilities, that you become enthralled with the idea of a total party kill. The annihilator, I guess you would call it, this person in a role play setting who knows the rules well enough to literally run circles around his players, can become somewhat aggressive with his story, trying to show the realism of it by making it so that the monsters have not only an opportunity but a desire to overcome and defeat the player. So when you're at this stage of development, the biggest thing to grab a hold of is a realization of what kind of blessings, if you will, that you can get returned to the players. This in turn leads to what historically was known as Monty Hall. Of course, that term has less meaning because, bless his heart, Monty Hall is no longer doing Let's Make a Deal. So I guess you could call it being a Brady monster, like Wayne Brady. You just get to the point where you just want to give everybody everything. You want to have them to have all the toys, because that way you get to experiment on the other side, see what you can do with the players to swerve them towards complete annihilation of your monsters and your enemies, thereby giving the players a bigger bang for their buck. And there's also a positive feedback loop that can develop when the players actually appreciate what you're doing for them and what you're allowing them to do and the cool toys you're giving them. And you can actually go overboard on this side. And with the Monty Hall, the biggest challenge is that the players will see the story as secondary to the collection of items. And as a game master, ultimately, this has to be kept in check, because having ultimate power in the hands of the player is ultimately a bad thing, because you no longer have a course correction mechanism. I believe from the development standpoint, this is the reason why Dungeons & Dragons in the 3rd edition and following eras were all about creating new things for the players, because even the company was in the idea of Monty Hall. Let's give the players all the power. Let's see what happens. And this, I think, also tied fairly well with a developing thought process that the game master should be part of the story as well. And the game master should be able to play a character and be a part of the adventure first person as well, and try to downplay the linear storyline or the story-based adventuring in favor of sandboxes. And when the company is producing new and more dangerous monsters and new and interesting toys for both the good guys and the bad guys to have. This does foment a feeling that you don't really need a storyteller. So there will be a point as a game master when you know enough about the game to play any of the roles. You have enough of the information to become any of the monsters and such like. So then it becomes a matter of finding out how to push the story back to the primary positioning. What is it? How is it that you make it so you want the story to be more valuable? Because ultimately, the difference between a game master and somebody who's just playing a game is that a game master is actually directing and guiding the story. So this leads to what I call the micromanagement phase of game mastery. And when you are a storyteller and you've gotten a realization that you need to put some limits on what the players do, the easiest way to do that is track the things that the players aren't tracking. This can be as simple as keeping track of how many hours their torches have been burning versus how long they've been underground, and watch their resources dwindle. It also means that you're tracking how much they've eaten, how much sleep they've gotten, and such, so that you start to micromanage. And while this is a positive thing from a control standpoint, it's a negative thing in terms of entertainment value of the game. Because while it is interesting for the game master to wonder whether or not the orcs are going to have enough food to make it through the winter, or whether they're going to raid the village again, the players kind of get bored with that kind of minutia. So the game master then therefore has to develop a new course. And historically, it ends up being that the person who's developed this kind of knowledge now starts to want to design his own material, and using all of those details to create a world in toto. They want to put how many days a week there are, how much sunlight the plants get, how often do the monsters have to feed, what kind of incentives do the locals have to trade with the bad guys, this kind of thing. And ultimately, this leads to extremely detailed existence. This detail-itis itself is a danger, because you can be hoisted on your own petard, so to speak. A game master who is very intent on where things happen and when they happen is going to have a considerable number of maps and precise locations for things. And when the players become aware of the power that they have to sandbox, they can simply walk off the edge of the map. And I think this is where a lot of game masters get lost. The reason why there are so many game masters that walk away from the shield and don't ever play anymore is that they've done all this work to create a story and the mechanisms and the physical locations that they want the players to meet in, that they don't know how to handle it when the players turn and walk away. And this is why in the Game Master series we go into the idea of bubble tech, the idea of taking the modular nature of an adventure and truly modularizing it so that the where is more dependent upon where the players are going than where the Game Master originally mapped them out to be. This does lead to some interesting challenges over time as the players become familiar with the geography of the world, and they know that, for example, well, we know that we fought the Master Intimos on the southern coast of Zenobia, so how is it possible for there to be an Intimos encounter clear over in Banbury or whatever? So the players start to consolidate and solidify the locations within your world. The advantage to this kind of system, though, is that the players have done it, and therefore the checks and balances are more in place to keep them moving forward rather than turning tail, because they know that the course is going to lead them certain places and they feel like they have a direction. This is in part one of the primary reasons why players will walk off the edge of the map, is simply they don't feel that they have any control in the system, and the one way they can get back at the Game Master is to put him into the position of discomfort. Now, all of these different tiers of game mastery that are leading towards an understanding of Battletech ultimately have to lead to an understanding of story dynamics. And hey, Scott, how you doing? I hope the audio is good on this. I don't know. I'm recording in my new studio here, and so I don't know how the sound is going. I hope you're able to hear me okay. And I hope you get a chance to go back and listen to the previous portions, because I'm sure that you jumped in the middle. But the real transition from being a dungeon master, a storyteller within a game series or a campaign, to being a true games master is when the story's effects are replicable. In other words, you can get the players to respond over and again in ways that you can manipulate and modify and control to suit your story. It almost sounds like mind control when I said it that way, but the reality is that a game master has to be able to direct the course of events, and this sets them apart from somebody who's just running a module who only can say, well, this says that I must be on page 2, so you must be ready to fight monster X, because that's what the book says. Instead, to be able to say, oh, well, you've swerved to the west and you've come across the River Leith, and on the River Leith there is this encounter, and know, no matter where they are in the world, where they are in the story as well. Now, a game master who has evolved through all these different processes gets to the point where, okay, we are on the brink of a world where everything that a player or a game master wants can be created as a product. And we all think, gosh, I want to be a publisher. I want my stories to be told over and over again. But the real challenge is that you need to draw the appeal back to you as a game master so that people want to hear the story you have to tell. And hence the story dynamics of Nikos. I have retold the story so many times that I know where everything is, which means a player can start literally anywhere and I know what they might be running into. If you are in a different stage of GMing, don't despair. Don't be frustrated with the fact that you're not where I am, because it took me decades to get here. Instead, let's talk about how we move from one stage to the other. We did a quick recap of all of them, but let's go back to the very beginning. If you're a beginning game master, my first recommendation is run modular adventures. Pick up and read the material for one of the Wizards of the Coast products if you're playing Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. If you're running Call of Cthulhu, look into their branded materials and find something, a storyline in there that you feel comfortable with running. If you are at that brand new level, for example, in 5th edition, hey, there he is. Thanks for the ping there, Scott. So I respond to that by going, yay, I like that. All right. So, Scott, if you have any questions, feel free to post them. I didn't make that as a commentary note, but I'm being a little free form on this one because I want to make sure that I'm able to solidify in people's minds the different evolutionary steps. Not that they are something that you must fall into or that you will necessarily have to fall through, but to be aware of all the different potential types of game master you are, to see where you are on the spectrum, so to speak. So we're speaking right now as far as an intro level game master. If you just don't know enough, by all means, become a voracious reader or listener if you can get to the material in audio form. By this, I want to refer to the starter set, for example, is a great place to go if you've not ever been a storyteller before, to get a basic premise and storyline that can be run. Just read everything. Scott and I were talking the other day in particular about the fact that many of the modules will give you a description of a room but forget to mention the fact that there's a monster in there, so that the players wander in thinking it's just a free room to loot, and then all of a sudden find themselves face to face with something hideous or particularly nasty or poisonous or whatever. So the real key to being a good game master is to be able to be in control of the story. Be the person who has all of the answers, and to do that you have to know all the questions, which means you have to have read all the materials. I can't emphasize how much that's the case in every aspect. I find myself quite often a little bit humbled by the fact that somebody brings up something that's in a rule book or in Volo's guide or Xanathar or whatever. Is like, oh yeah, I hadn't read that, or it's been a while since I read that. I might want to read that again. So just realize that as an entry-level game master, you want to know your material, because the players have to see you as the authority on the subject. Once you've done that, and as I said, once you're past that stage, then it's a matter of getting to know all of the material, all of the monsters, all of the creatures, all of that. And so, guess what? To be a good game master, you have to be a pretty consistent reader. You've got to be able to consume material, digest it, and make it your own. So when we speak of this second stage, because we're talking about past the beginner here, we're talking about the developing game master. This is when you're exploring and experimenting. This means experiment and explore to your heart's content, but don't take it out on the players if they don't know. In other words, you've got to learn a level of compassion as you come along, because just because you didn't know that the poisons could cause you to become unconscious, or that exhaustion led to a lack of movement eventually, you shouldn't punish the players with that. You may want to smack them in the head with it now and then to get them to remember that you're the guy who's in charge of the story. But the goal should never be to design a system that is by itself TPK, that it's going to be a total party kill, regardless of the player's skills. This, of course, leads again to the experimental stage of learning how the toys work, how the items work, how the things that can be bestowed to the players can be used to make the story more dynamic. But be careful not to let that lead you into a place of giving away the farm, so to speak. One of the greatest challenges in a game master's existence is when he's developed a storyline with characters who have officially outgrown his own ability to handle their advances. I can remember when I first was learning the rules for 3rd edition and adding that to my repertoire, the biggest challenge is that the D20 glut had led to there being a huge number of manufacturers and publishers that were providing product and content, including feats and skills for players, to the point where a game master who has new players coming in might end up with a handful of talents or skills that he's not able to overcome with his current arsenal of abilities. And even into 5th edition, I can tell you that my initial wonder at the positive addition of the idea of advantage disadvantage kind of blindsided me to the reality that characters can be developed to have armor classes that are virtually unattainable to CR 1 or less creatures, so that a bundle of goblins that used to be a problem for a group of first level characters all of a sudden are nothing but a nuisance because they literally cannot hit anymore. So it's a matter of evolving as a storyteller and developing the arsenal of ways to take out a character. I think that in a future session I will actually talk about the, if you will, the 7 deadly sins, if you will, the places that a game master can get into trouble when the players know more about the game than they do. And these stem from, of course, the different things you have to know about the game. But, initially it's things like the power of cantrips. they're incredibly useful, and at lower level they seem to be arguably OP compared to previous adventure parameters. But even a cantrip sequence can be overcome if a game master's paying attention. Now, this does lead to the next part of this, and that is as you've evolved to the point of Monty Hall, when you're starting to give away lots of stuff, you also have to become savvy with the monsters. And 5th edition does open this up quite a bit by allowing the monsters to be leveled, that you can actually grant them, in certain cases, classes and skills and proficiencies, and more importantly, feat-like capabilities that can put them back either on par or in advance of your players. So it becomes a balancing act. And one of the things that I know you and I, Scott, have talked about at length is how do you balance the CR rating. And since I started running Adventurers League, that has been a question that has kind of haunted me a bit, because I couldn't articulate it, and yet when I'm in the process of game mastering, I'm able to do that balancing act on the fly. And so in a future session, we're going to talk about the actual developing of your own personal CR balancing mechanism, and how do you balance what is important for the players with what is best for the story. Well, we're at about the half an hour mark, and although the material could have gone a lot further, I did already glance on all the different tiers. So I just wanted to catch up that we're about halfway at this point. We do have the 3rd tier, which follows after Monty Hall, which is Detailitis, and this is where the game master, you start to wonder, how does water get into the city? How often does it rain? What about flooding? What about earthquakes? What kind of things can a villain do that are natural, that are going to cause problems for the players, and how do those delay the adventure? How to use them as time controls. And this does lead to considerable amount of time spent drawing maps and maybe orbital patterns for the planets and moons and stars that are involved with the storyline. And the gist of my creative emphasis when I was younger was in creating extensive maps. And all I can tell you is that where I am now in the universe, I need, and a game master, a dungeon master will need to have a complete understanding of the world as it is, only to the extent of how far the players will reach. I guess my way of saying this is that sorry to befuddle myself. Let's say it this way. You should have your adventure world created to the point where if the players took off in any direction by any form of transportation they have at their resources, you can handle up to a week in any direction. Now, because I've had characters up to 10th level that have instantaneous teleportation without error, that means that I have to have virtually the whole planet and anything they could reach within, say a solar unit from that, at least theoretically mapped, if not completely mapped. And again, because of bubble tech, I only have to create those points to which they go. So by controlling what they have in their minds as options, you control the possibilities that you might run into. So yes, the ultimate goal is to have a complete planet mapped out, but that is not where you have to start. Simply realize that you need to map at least a week out in any direction so that you're able to cope with the players if they decide to run off the map, and to give you places and times to use bubble tech to draw them back to the primary story. Now, once you have started to develop the bubble tech mechanism, and we've talked a little bit about it, we'll go into more detail in the Academy itself. The next step, of course, is to realize, or to I guess you'd say, actualize this knowledge to get the players to go where you want, and we'll talk about that coming up. But as a game master, the final step of it, if you will, is that at any time the players can land at any place in the game world you've created, and you'll be able to just start the story there. So, yeah, we are at the halfway mark. Scott, at the half hour mark. Scott, do you have any particular questions you'd like me to answer? Because I'm going to go ahead and call this session for now. I know it's a little shorter, but as I said, it's a little bit impromptu as well. We'll get back to full session starting next week. So if anybody has any questions, feel free to post them. Otherwise, I will catch you all later. Remember, I do have now game sessions on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Saturdays. Those are all public events. Monday night is Adventurers League. It is these are all the primary events are held at Gamology in Montclair, and you can contact me directly for the address to that location, or you can go to the Gamology website, and in particular the Gamology RPGs. This is Jonathan Albin, the Game Market Guru, on behalf of Just in Time Productions Games Mastery Series. Thank you guys, and have a good day.